The Gen X man who can't sit still, even on vacation. There is a particular kind of man who can be standing on a beautiful beach, sun warm on his shoulders, ocean stretching endlessly in front of him, and within 20 minutes he will have rearranged the umbrella, checked the cooler twice, walked to find out where the nearest bathroom is, and started mentally planning dinner. Everyone around him is relaxing. He is, in some quiet, restless way, still working, even though there is officially nothing left to do. This is the Gen X man who cannot sit still, even on vacation, and the wise observer has watched this pattern play out in countless families, usually met with the same affectionate, slightly exasperated joke. He doesn't know how to relax, but underneath that gentle family joke sits something far more layered, something worth taking seriously rather than simply laughing off. To understand why stillness feels so uncomfortable to him, the wise observer must return, as always, to the architecture of his childhood. Many Gen X kids grew up in households where value was measured almost entirely through usefulness. A child who was busy, productive, helpful, was praised. A child who was simply sitting, simply existing without visible output, often went unnoticed, or worse, was seen as lazy, aimless, in need of correction. Rest was rarely modeled as something worth doing for its own sake. It was, at best, a brief pause between tasks, never a legitimate destination in itself. This lesson, absorbed so early it never announced itself as a lesson at all, quietly wired something durable into him. Productivity became inseparable from self-worth. Being useful wasn't just something he did, it became, over years of repetition, something he was. And so decades later, sitting on a beach chair with nothing scheduled and nothing required of him, some old internal alarm quietly goes off, whispering that this stillness is dangerous, that idle time is a kind of failure waiting to be corrected. Consider what an actual vacation looks like through his eyes. Where his wife sees an open afternoon to read a book on the porch, he sees a list of small tasks that have somehow gone unaddressed. The grill needs cleaning, the rental car should be checked, the cooler needs restocking, someone should look into tomorrow's weather. None of these tasks are actually urgent. Most of them aren't even necessary. But performing them gives him something rest alone cannot. A sense of purpose, a feeling that he has earned his place in the day, that he hasn't simply been idle and therefore, in some old internal ledger, worthless. The wise observer wants to name something important here. This restlessness isn't really about disliking vacation. It's about not yet having the internal permission to enjoy it without earning it first. He genuinely wants to relax. He simply doesn't fully trust that relaxation is something he's allowed to have without first proving, through visible effort, that he deserves the break. There's a particular scene worth picturing that captures this pattern precisely. A family gathers around a campfire on the second night of a camping trip, everyone finally settled into the easy rhythm of vacation. He sits for exactly 4 minutes before standing up to check the fire, then to adjust a tent stake that was already secure, then to reorganize the cooler for the 3rd time that day. His wife watches this with a familiar, tired affection, having long ago stopped expecting him to simply sit still through an entire evening without finding something to tend to. This pattern intensifies specifically during unstructured time, which reveals something important about what's actually happening underneath it. He can relax reasonably well during structured activities, a scheduled fishing trip, a planned hike, an activity with a clear beginning and end. What genuinely unsettles him is empty, open time with no task attached, because empty time forces him to sit with himself, with his own thoughts, without the comfortable buffer of a task to hide behind. For a man who spent much of his life converting difficult feelings into productive action, unstructured stillness can feel less like relaxation and more like exposure. It's worth examining how this shows up specifically on family vacations, because the impact often lands hardest on the people who simply wanted quality time with him. His children, now adults themselves, sometimes remember childhood vacations less for the destinations and more for the particular restlessness of their father, the way he was present physically, but rarely fully still. rarely fully available for the unstructured, meandering conversations that actually build closeness. They loved him. They also, quietly, wished he could have simply sat with them on a porch without needing to fix, check, or organize something at the same time. There's a genuine grief embedded in this pattern that rarely gets acknowledged directly. Vacations are, for many families, supposed to be the container where connection happens most naturally. Long, unstructured hours together, nothing competing for attention. For him, though, that very lack of structure can become the obstacle rather than the gift, because it strips away the productive tasks he has relied on his entire life to feel legitimate, safe, and worthy of the space he's taking up. The wise observer also wants to point out how this pattern shows up in smaller, quieter ways beyond the obvious examples. He often struggles to simply watch a movie without also doing something else with his hands, sorting mail, fixing a small object, checking his phone for something to attend to. He rarely takes a nap without first accomplishing something that justifies it. Even his idea of relaxing often involves a task disguised as leisure, a long drive with no destination, a home improvement project framed as a hobby, a fishing trip that's really about the ritual of preparation as much as the fishing itself. It's worth noting, too, how this pattern intersects with his relationship to guilt, specifically. When he does manage to sit still for an extended period, truly still, without a task, a subtle discomfort often creeps in that he rarely names directly. Some old internal voice suggests he should be doing something, that this stillness is borrowed, time he hasn't quite earned, that somewhere, something is waiting for his attention, and he's neglecting it by simply existing in this moment. This guilt isn't rational, and on some level he often knows it isn't rational. That knowledge, though, rarely makes the discomfort go away. There's a particular tenderness worth naming in how this pattern shows up as he ages, especially around retirement. Many men from this generation describe retirement not as the relief they expected, but as a genuine identity crisis, precisely because the external structures that used to justify his existence, the job, the schedule, the constant list of responsibilities, suddenly disappear all at once. Without them, he's left facing the very thing vacations always threaten to expose, the uncomfortable question of who he is when he isn't producing anything at all. This is often when the compulsive busyness intensifies rather than fades. Retired men from this generation frequently fill their newly open days with an almost frantic schedule of projects, errands, and self-assigned tasks, not because the tasks are genuinely necessary, but because an empty calendar feels, to him, dangerously close to the very worthlessness his childhood quietly taught him to fear. The wise observer has seen this pattern repeatedly. A man who spent 40 years waiting for retirement, only to fill it immediately with a version of the same busyness he thought he was escaping. There's a particular irony worth naming in how this pattern shows up specifically around the people meant to benefit most from his presence. His grandchildren, visiting for a week in summer, often remember him less as the grandfather who sat and told stories, and more as the one who was always fixing something, always halfway between the porch and the garage, present in body, but rarely fully settled into the unhurried rhythm that childhood memories are usually made of. This isn't a failure of love. It's simply the same old pattern, still running quietly in the background, decades after it first formed. It's worth examining, too, how this restlessness shows up specifically during moments meant for celebration. A milestone birthday, an anniversary dinner, a holiday gathering, occasions explicitly designed around presence rather than productivity. He'll often find himself checking on the grill one more time, refilling drinks that don't need refilling, straightening chairs that are already straight, converting a moment meant for stillness into another small opportunity for useful motion. The people around him rarely mind, having long since adjusted their expectations, but the pattern itself reveals just how deeply the equation between worth and productivity has settled into him. There's a specific relationship worth noting between this restlessness and his relationship to his own body as he ages. Physical limitations that come with getting older, a knee that aches after too much activity, a back that protests certain movements, energy that doesn't quite match what it used to be, often produce a particular kind of quiet grief in him, distinct from ordinary aging concerns. For a man whose sense of worth has always been tied to what his body could accomplish, physical limitation doesn't just mean discomfort. It means facing, more directly than ever before, the exact question his restlessness has always helped him avoid. Who am I when I'm not doing something useful? The wise observer wants to point out something tender about how this pattern intersects with sleep, too. Many men like this struggle genuinely with the transition from a busy day into rest at night, often staying up later than necessary, finishing one more small task, checking one more thing, unable to simply allow the day to end without a final, concrete accomplishment attached to it. Sleep itself can feel, in some old and irrational corner of his mind, like another form of the same dangerous stillness necessary, but never quite comfortable, never quite something he fully permits himself to surrender into without a fight. Consider, too, how differently he approaches vacations that involve other men from his generation versus vacations centered around family relaxation. A fishing trip with old friends, structured around a shared task with a clear purpose, allows him to be fully present, fully relaxed, laughing and engaged in a way that can surprise people who only know his restless version. The difference isn't the company, it's the structure. Shared purposeful activity gives him the same permission to exist that unstructured family time withholds, and understanding this distinction helps explain why he can seem like two entirely different men, depending on the shape of the day in front of him. It's worth naming, too, a specific and often overlooked cost of this pattern, the toll it takes on him personally, quietly, over decades. A body that rarely gets true rest accumulates a particular kind of exhaustion that sleep alone cannot fully resolve, the exhaustion of a nervous system that has never fully learned how to power down. Many men like this reach their 60s carrying a bone-deep tiredness they can't quite explain, having spent 40 or 50 years unable to access the kind of restorative stillness that actually replenishes a person, rather than simply distracting them from what stillness might reveal. There's one final pattern worth naming, because it captures the emotional core of everything discussed so far. When he does, occasionally, manage a full afternoon of genuine stillness, no task, no project, simply sitting beside someone he loves, it often produces an unexpected wave of emotion he struggles to explain. Something in him seems to recognize briefly what he's been missing all these years. Not the absence of work, but the presence of permission. For a few minutes, or if he's lucky, a few hours, he gets to simply exist without earning it, and something in his chest loosens that he didn't fully realize had been held tight for most of his adult life. There is real hope embedded in this pattern, though, and it's worth sitting with before closing. Many men do eventually learn, often slowly and imperfectly, that stillness isn't actually dangerous, that rest doesn't have to be earned through visible output, that simply existing beside the people he loves is itself a legitimate and valuable use of time. This learning rarely arrives through a single dramatic realization. It usually comes in small, quiet moments. An afternoon where he catches himself sitting still for 10 full minutes without reaching for a task, and notices, with mild surprise, that nothing terrible happened as a result. The wise observer's closing thought is this: if you love a man who can't seem to sit still, even on vacation, understand that the restlessness was never really about the beach, or the cooler, or the tent stake that didn't actually need adjusting. It was about a much older lesson, learned so early it never felt like a lesson at all, that worth had to be earned through motion, and stillness had to be justified before it could be allowed. The kindest thing anyone can offer him isn't frustration at his inability to relax, but a gentle invitation, repeated patiently over time, that he is allowed to simply be here, doing nothing at all, and that this alone has always been enough. Not the fixing, not the checking, not the endless small motions that have filled his hands for a lifetime. Just him, sitting quietly beside the people he loves, finally, fully, without needing to earn his place in the moment at all. And perhaps, in that quiet, unremarkable stillness, he will discover what he was always searching for in motion, a sense of belonging that never required a single task to prove it, simply waiting, patiently, for him to finally stop long enough to notice it was already there.